So what I'm going to talk about today is something that I think is of interest to a lot of people, and something that people think they know a lot about, but when we look a little bit beneath the surface, find out that there's a much richer story behind that, and that is the connection between Hitler and the automobile. When we look at the history of the automobile in Germany, we find that, of course, it has a very long history. The automobile was actually invented in Germany back in the 1880s, and of course some of the great automobile manufacturers are still in Germany: Mercedes-Benz, the factory there in Stuttgart, the Porsche, the BMW as well. There are all a host of great automobile manufacturers in Germany, and in some respects Germany is just like the United States in being car crazy. In fact, some people argue that Germans love their cars more than they love their kids, and there's some truth to that. But when we talk about the history of the automobile in Germany, things get a little more complicated. When people think about Hitler and the automobile, we of course immediately think of the Volkswagen, the old VW Beetle, and of course we think of the Autobahn, and Hitler is given credit for developing both of those. When we look at that, this history is both a little more complicated and actually a lot more interesting, and reveals a lot about the nature of National Socialism in Germany. So let's deal with these each in turn. Let's deal first with the automobile. The automobile was originally in Germany a luxury item. It was designed for upper class transportation. Manufacturers largely steered away from producing an automobile for the masses. The example of Henry Ford, or to a certain extent Citroën in France, was something that they felt wasn't appropriate for their market. One manufacturer said that if poor people or working class people wanted to travel into the countryside, they should take a bus, but a private automobile just wasn't seen as being something for which there was a market in Germany. Now, there were people who advocated the development of a car for the masses, or a Volksauto, as they called it, a people's car, but those voices were relatively few and far between, and certainly didn't get anywhere in terms of manufacturing, like we will see, say, in the United States with Henry Ford. That will change in 1933 when the Nazis come to power. Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 1933, and the automobile was a perfect vehicle, no pun intended, for Hitler's ideological viewpoint, and more broadly speaking for National Socialists as a whole. In the history of and thought of the National Socialists, there's a concept known as the Volksgemeinschaft, and or people's community is how that is translated. And the idea of the people's community was one in which they envisioned a world without classes, in which workers of the hand, working class, and workers of the mind, the professional and entrepreneurial class, worked side by side to create a new Germany. Of course, it goes without saying that this new Germany was only for those deemed ethnically pure, or at least pure enough to meet the standards of the new government. Those who weren't considered German need not apply. They were originally to be forced from Germany, or at the very least stripped of their citizenship. Of course, we know how that turned out. The project of building the Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, ultimately resulted, of course, in the horrific tragedies of the Holocaust, with the deaths of some 6 million Jews and other so-called undesirables. Well, the car actually plays a role in this project of building a people's community. The automobile was seen as a symbol of, well, class superiority, and one of the goals of the new government was to promote the widespread ownership of the automobile. The automobile was seen as a tangible commitment of the government's commitment to the people's community. That challenge, of course, was how to build a car, who was to build it, and where exactly to build it, basically how to finance this project. In the face of an automobile industry that really didn't favor the project at all. Well, the entity within the government that sort of took on this issue, and actually it was a bit of a misnomer to think of it as a government project. It certainly had government support, but the organization was actually a party organization called the Strength Through Joy organization, or the Kraft durch Freude movement. And this was a organization sponsored by the German Labor Front. The German Labor Front was a forced amalgamation of labor unions and industry organizations, largely representing industrial interests, into one big happy family. Of course, their interests weren't necessarily one and the same, but the idea was to force them to get along and to support the government in the larger project of the party. The Strength Through Joy movement serves as the primary sponsor of this competition to design a new automobile for the masses. Obviously, they couldn't build luxury cars, so the car had to be redesigned, made more affordable. And the engineer who wins this competition, who signs the winning entry, is Ferdinand Porsche. His later projects will come from the company that bears that name. He's more famous for his sports cars, but he is, of course, the architect of the Volkswagen Beetle. It was a very stripped down vehicle, made very affordable, but the question is, who was going to build it? No manufacturer wanted to build it, so the Nazi government decided to create a new company, the Volkswagen Company, and it was to be financed by mandatory contributions from other companies. It was also the actual financing of the company was also furthered by a curious system. In the United States, most of the time we buy our automobiles through a loan. We borrow the money, we purchase the car, and then we begin the process of paying back the loan. In Germany, through the auspices of the German Labor Front, they actually paid on an installment plan. People were asked to contribute $5 a week, or excuse me, 5 marks a week. And over the course of a period of time until they had contributed 900 Reichsmarks, and then they could get their vehicle. The problem is that by the time they had enough money accumulated and had worked out all the bugs in terms of the construction, the Second World War had broken out. No one ever got their vehicle that they had paid for. The assembly lines were and production was shifted over to military uses. And so while there were Volkswagens being produced in the late 1930s and early 40s, they were more similar to the military-style Jeeps that we're familiar with rather than a passenger vehicle. And so this idea kind of falls short. The other aspect of the building of a people's community that connects to transportation and the automobile is the construction of the Autobahn. And people give Hitler credit for building the Autobahn, and certainly there was a tremendous expansion of the Autobahn system during the Third Reich. This is partly seen as a means of combating unemployment. The reality is, though, that Hitler didn't conceive of the Autobahn, although certainly the sycophants in the Third Reich gave him credit for it. In fact, they were called the roads of Hitler, or the Straßen des Führers, the roads of the Führer. The idea was that they were a tremendous achievement, similar to the construction of the pyramids in Egypt, and stood as a testament to the will of one man, Adolf Hitler. The reality is that in this area, like so many others, the Nazis simply borrowed from previous works and claimed that as their own. In fact, as early as the 1920s, there had been various experiments with constructing something that ultimately comes into being as the Autobahn, or freeway system, with limited access by other vehicles, higher speeds that allow, and of course straighter routes, not following the terrain but building tunnels and bridges to make the path as flat and level and as straight as possible. The argument for these back in the 1920s was primarily economic. There was also some military arguments for them as well. And so there were already construction projects across Germany geared towards the production of the Autobahn when Hitler came to power. The Nazis will dramatically expand the highway system, the Autobahn system. Even here, this bears a ideological dimension as well. When new sites were being embarked upon, when new construction was begun, it was clearly done with propaganda in mind. The Autobahn system was seen as an important face in the battle against unemployment, as they called it. There was this effort on the part of the Nazis to sort of militarize many different aspects of society. So the battle against unemployment was an important element of that. And here too, when the opening ceremonies take place, when ground is first being broken, Hitler is on the scene, and the propaganda efforts are full bore. In fact, there was one radio program that was describing what Hitler was doing when he sort of digs that first ceremonial shovel into the dirt. In that, the narrator says, that was no ceremonial shovelful, but the Führer is really getting to work. He is doing his fair share. And so the effort on the part of the government was to portray the construction of the Autobahn as a way to break through some of these class barriers that had existed in Germany. Another example of that comes from a later radio program, partly fictionalized, in which it involves a couple of workers at a barracks where they are at a work site, and they're talking about how it was because of the Führer's will that the Autobahn was begun, how it had brought important elements of German society together, so that no longer was there this class divide between rich and poor, between capitalists and working class that had existed prior to the Third Reich. Well, ultimately, the 1930s will see an incredible increase in the number of automobiles on the road in Germany, not just because of government policies. Again, the Autobahn was an important element in that, but there are other government policies as well that help promote the ownership of automobiles. And one of the challenges then becomes is, how do we handle the increase in traffic in an age where people aren't used to cars being on the roads? For traditionally, the roads in Germany had been of mixed use. You had pedestrians, you had people riding horses, you had wagons, had all sorts of vehicles at different speeds with different needs trying to use the same roads. Well, then you throw the automobile and the truck and other vehicles into that mix, and you have a recipe for disaster. We see an incredible increase in the number of traffic accidents, of deaths and injuries. And the Nazis will come up with various ways of combating this, but also to promote the use of the automobile. And they use this uniquely German concept called the Verkehrsgemeinschaft. And translated loosely, this means traffic community. And the idea between the traffic community, which is really just a corollary of that people's community, but in the realm of traffic, was the idea that people would take consideration upon one another, that they, through a spirit of goodwill and friendship and camaraderie, that they would learn to sort of coexist on the road. The reality is, of course, that pedestrians and vehicles can't coexist, cyclists and vehicles can't coexist side by side. It's simply too dangerous. But there were various public education efforts which said that if you took consideration for your fellow traffic participants, traffic community participants, that the number of accidents would be greatly reduced. In short, if simply people would take consideration of one another and be courteous drivers, that the roads would be safe for vehicles and pedestrians alike. The reality, of course, is far different. The automobile cannot coexist side by side with the pedestrian or the cyclist. It's simply too dangerous. And so what the Nazis were really trying to do was to make Germany safe for mass motorization, which was ultimately their goal, because of the importance that the automobile held in their eyes, both as a commercial and economic activity, which was very good for business, as well as a propaganda vehicle, and sort of a testament to their commitment to a classless society. So what we'll see then are various measures of education. We'll see the creation of small-scale models of traffic education. So for example, in the city of Stuttgart, they'll build this little scale model of a city street with little bitty roads, and the children that go to this traffic school can ride in little bitty cars. They can take turns pedaling their little bitty cars, learning the traffic rules, learning how to cross safely. That was a real problem, because people were used to simply just stepping out into traffic because it wasn't that dangerous prior to the automobile. Now it's very dangerous, the stakes are much higher, and so they have to educate not only young people but old people alike. There were public safety campaigns that warned people of the danger of the streets. For example, telling people that if they step out in a crosswalk that they need to hurry up across the street, that if the light turns, they're not simply to freeze in the middle of the traffic crosswalk. And so there are all sorts of things that this new technology of the automobile that forced people to sort of rethink their approach to the streets. And the Nazis certainly encouraged that. Well, ultimately this dream of a classless society, one that was safe for the automobile, ultimately had to carry some teeth with it as well. In fact, there are instances where Hitler gets very frustrated over the behavior of some of his own party officials and government officials in traffic. The nature of people is to sort of flaunt their superiority, and many of the high-ranking members of the Nazi Party and of the government often ignored the traffic rules because they felt that they were above the law. Hitler caught wind of some of this through reports to him. He also saw some of this firsthand. There was an individual who sped past his motorcade because he felt they were going too slow. Well, the person ended up being arrested and sent to a concentration camp for a year's worth of hard labor. This sending a signal that no one was to be above the law. But the reality is that Hitler was trying to create a system that was safe for the automobile. Ultimately, the Nazi dream of mass motorization and an automobile for every person who desired one, as I said, is going to be cut short by Hitler's decision to go to war. The vast resources necessary to support the war effort, the movement of the various production lines to what we might say are military uses rather than civilian uses, means that the dream of mass motorization in Germany will be forestalled. The idea was that if the Nazis had succeeded, if Germany had succeeded in winning the Second World War, that they would have picked up where they had left off. Instead, We actually see the exact opposite. Because Germany is defeated, this dream of mass motorization will be postponed not only during the Second World War, but for the 5 or 6 years immediately after the war, when Germany is basically left in ruins. And so while Hitler deserves a certain amount of credit for pushing the project, the reality is that the course of the automobile in the larger span of German history is not nearly so simple as to say that the automobile or the Volkswagen and the Autobahn are the creation of Hitler. But and the reality is that both predate Hitler, and both will come back into existence in a major way after the Second World War. And it's really not until the miracle, or the economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, that we see mass motorization in Germany.